Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the NRW. I'm your host today, Rob Medina, and I thank you all very much for joining me here today because today I'm going to be reviewing the movie AccidentMan, Hitman's Holiday. This is the sequel to the 2018 film AccidentMan, which also stars ScottAdkins, but that first film was directed by Jesse V. Johnson, and it's easily one of my favorite ScottAdkins films he's ever done, along with Jesse V. Johnson, who directed the film. It's one of his best directed movies, I think, in my opinion, for a number of different reasons, which I got into with a review that I did with David Netsicado a few years back here on the NRW. So if you have not checked out that review, I recommend you guys do so here. And I also recommend you guys check out the first film if you've not checked out this movie. But the directing duties this time around went to the Kirby brothers, who were making their feature film debut with AccidentMan, Hitman's Holiday. And I can truthfully say that I had a lot of fun with this movie. This film is just a great, straightforward action movie, which is what I love. It reminds me a lot of like the late 80s, early 90s type of action films where it just kind of balls to the walls, great characters, but just crazy scenarios. And it's just a lot of fun, really. But I will also be honest and say, too, that I do believe that the first AccidentMan film is the better of the two. And that's not to say that this movie didn't have any great qualities that the first film didn't have. It did have it, but I felt like the first film was superior in some of those areas that I thought this film did well, but the first one did much better, in my opinion, which I'll point out in the review here. But I will also point out, too, that I will not be getting into any spoilers here because even though we can figure out who's going to win at the end of the day with this movie, but there are just some certain moments in the film that do occur that I actually was genuinely surprised with. And I had a lot of fun with it as well, too. So no spoilers, but of course, I'll get into the plot synopsis, the positives, the negatives, and then my rating. The AccidentMan is back, and this time he must best the top assassins in the world to protect and the ungrateful son of a mafia boss, save the life of his only friend, and rekindle his relationship with his maniacal father figure. And that's the film in a nutshell. So now let's get into my positives. So my first positive with this movie is with ScottAdkins. For those who don't know already, I'm sure a lot of people do know by this point, is that I am a huge ScottAdkins fan. I've been a fan of him since 2006, ever since I came across the film Undisputed 2, Last Man Standing. That was a film that made me a fan of ScottAdkins ever since he portrayed the character of Boyka, which is one of his most famous roles he's ever done. He's ever done here, I should say. But this particular film, I should also point out too, is that there's moments in this film that you get to see where ScottAdkins as the actor gets to shine in this movie, because I think a lot of people may forget that he's a very good actor. When you watch movies like Savage Dog, which is a film that was also directed by Jesse V. Johnson, easily one of his best films in my opinion. And then you look at a movie like Avengement, The Debt Collector 1 and 2. I'm trying to see what else he's also done as well that showcases a lot of his ranges when it comes to acting here. But I mean, Mike Fallon, the character he plays in these AccidentMan films, is another aspect of his ability to showcase what he's truly capable of pulling off here, especially when it comes to the comedic moments that you get with this franchise here. So this movie does give ScottAdkins the ability to showcase not just his martial arts skills, which we already know he's more than capable of pulling off here, but other aspects of the character that when it comes to some of the more dramatic moments, the character depth that you see where he's finding some way to deal with his internal struggles along the way, and then being able to rekindle some sort of relationship that he hopes to kind of patch up here along the way, which does happen in this movie here too, where it's not an easy thing to pull off when you have a mixed bag of everything put together: comedy, action. I wouldn't say horror, but because there is a little bit of blood and guts here, but there's just a lot of zaniness in this movie that you still have that time to shine. At least in this case for ScottAdkins, he has the time to shine to be able to truly showcase what he's able to pull off here amongst the chaos that occurs in this movie, but still keep that intact along the way for you to be on his side despite all the chaos that he's going through throughout this narrative here. So I give a lot of credit to Scott and everyone else involved when it came to putting this film together. Because another thing about this movie too that I also want to point out in terms of the positive is that the characters in this film is really what makes the film that great. Yes, don't get me wrong, the action, which I'll get into a little bit here, is fantastic, but it's all about the characters. It's really about getting to know them and understand the relationships that they are trying to form here with one another, whether it be in a good or in a negative light. But you understand where everyone is coming from here, and that's what it's really all about, and having a good time with them along the way as well too. So I think everybody, in my opinion, when it comes to the acting department and really trying to get to know the characters, whether it be for a few minutes or the entirety of the film, you know where they're coming from because you understand their motivation, you understand what their end goal is. And at the end of the day, do you really care about what their journey is all about? And for me, I certainly did. So I think everyone did a really good job when it came to that. Of course, now when it came to the action here, I just expected a great action film, and I did certainly get that here too. But I also want to point out too that this is a film that I initially thought was choreographed by Tim Mann, who did the choreography for the first AccidentMan film, but I don't think he did a whole lot of it this time around here too. Instead, we've got someone else to more or less take over that. And with the Kirby brothers, who are making directorial debut with this movie, they do have an action background as well too, especially with the stunt world, where they understood the importance of having to shoot the action scenes in this film and being able to give it a new take on it with this film as opposed to what we got in the first film. Although I did enjoy a great deal, but there were certain things about the action sequences that I felt like was a little off-putting for me personally. Not to say that the direction they went with was not good for the film, because I think it worked well, but it just wasn't necessarily my cup of tea, which I'll point out with my negatives here, but it's not a major negative, it's just more or less my nitpick here. But I did appreciate with what they're trying to go for, and given that the audience, the experience of actually being in the action, whereas in the first film you're just kind of seeing it from a spectator standpoint, which is all great. And you definitely do get that in this movie here too, where you still have those spectator moments, if you will, but you are more or less more immersed into the actions, where you actually feel like you're involved with it, which I thought was very unique and I thought worked really well. But again, it was just it was that fine line of like, I prefer one over the other here. But again, I still thought, despite my nitpicking on that, I still enjoyed it for what it was, and I enjoyed it what they were approaching here, because I thought it did work very well. The other thing I also want to point out too is with the directing with the Kirby brothers, who are making their feature directorial debut with this film. I thought they did a really good job with this movie. I also want to point out too with the directing here is that, considering that they have a stunt background, they have a real clear understanding of storytelling and telling the action with the story. So the action isn't just action for the sake of action. There are key elements to be able to tell certain story beats along the way, and then have the action infused into that as well too. And what I also appreciate about this film too is that although it is virtually almost a nonstop action film in a lot of ways, but you do have breaks in between the fights where you have time to breathe, to be able to collect yourself and being able to absorb the information that's being processed through, and then have the ability to kind of get more or less recharged and then go right back at it again, which I thought this film did so good in my opinion. So I got to give everyone a lot of props for that as well. But as far as everything else is concerned with regards to the story, I mean, the story, as I've already mentioned before in the plot synopsis, it just follows this with Mike Fallon having to protect a mafia mob boss son who is pretty much a dig, and his way of dealing with it, which I thought was very funny. And then at the same time, you get to be able to learn more about the character of Mike Fallon along the way, where he's really trying to patch up all the shit that he has done in the first film and trying to be able to rekindle whatever relationship is left over, hopefully to try to make amends with those he had more or less burned along the way. And without really getting too much into spoilers here, but I'll just say that he definitely does have the opportunity to do so here. But overall, my thoughts on the film, as far as the positive concern, it's a wonderful, enjoyable action film, great characters, great story, and just a lot of fun. So that's the end of my positives. So now let's get into my negatives. My first negative with this film is that I felt like the things that worked so well with AccidentMan in terms of taking the time to be able to tell the character's story, which you do have with this film, but I felt like there were certain aspects of those development that I thought had been done so well in the first AccidentMan film was kind of missing in this movie. So for example, in the first AccidentMan film, you get to see that Mike Fallon is a complete dick, but he's good at what he does, but he's just not a very likable guy. But along the way, there is an investment for you as the audience to be able to connect with him, where you realize that he had pretty much was the catalyst of tearing up the relationship he had with his ex-girlfriend. Then we come to find out his ex-girlfriend was pregnant, but she was killed along the way. So now we can actually side with the character once you see that he's not this complete ice cold killer, but instead he does have some humanity in him. And that's what I thought worked so well in that movie, where you have the time to really spend with him, even though the film is just like 90 minutes long, but you have enough time to spend with him to truly side with the character along the way. So at the end of the film, when he defeats all the bad guys, and despite the fact he's burned some bridges along the way too for a decision he felt like was best for himself, you side with the character at the end of the day. And I think a lot of it does have to do with Jesse V. Johnson's take on that character, because if you look at Jesse's films, it's always about the story, it's always about the character, and then the action is just, I'm not gonna say secondary, but it's just the icing on the cake. So I think a lot of it does come from Jesse's direction. And not to say that the Kirby brothers don't do a good job in developing the character, but I felt like it's you can clearly tell that they're really good at what they do. But I think what needs to be developed more in terms of their directing is for more like characters, because it's a fast-paced movie. It's one thing leading to another, but it moves very quickly and it's a lot of fun. But the character development, I think, was the thing that was missing the most. But because I've already seen the first film, a lot of those missing beats that I felt like that was necessary in this film, I wasn't too hard on it because I already knew what had happened. But for someone who's never seen the first film and watched this movie, because you can still watch this film not having seen the first movie and understand what's going on, which I thought was brilliant about this film. But the thing is that I certainly felt like there's certain character moments that the first one did so well that this one was kind of lacking in. But that's not to say that you don't get great character moments. You do get a lot of that, but I felt like there were certain connective tissue that I felt the first one had done very well when it came to those development that this one did not have. I know I'm repeating myself, but I hope you understand where I'm coming from here. But the other thing I also want to point out too about this film is that when it came to the action, now I said earlier that when it came to the action sequences, this time around, I think the Kirby brothers and everyone else involved had wanted to get the audience to make it so that they feel like they were in the action as opposed to just watching as a spectator, which I thought worked very well. And it was really nice to be able to see it from that perspective. But something about that kind of directing was a little jarring for me personally, because not to say there was a lot of shaky sequences, although there was a little bit of that, but it just was that part of it of as far as the action is concerned, kind of left me a little unfulfilled, if in a lot of ways. But when there are some great moments, which there are plenty of in this film in terms of the action, a lot of it does come from that wide angle shot as opposed to the up close and personal shot, which they've done very well with. So I'm not taking that away, but it just wasn't my cup of tea because the way it was executed just didn't necessarily work for me all that well. I still enjoyed it regardless, but I thought that the first film did that a little bit better in terms of the action sequences, whereas this film definitely did something new, which I appreciate. It just wasn't really my cup of tea. I'm sure as the directors get more opportunities to be able to direct more of these films, they'll figure out a fine line between how to handle that hopefully a little bit better. But maybe it's just me that just doesn't click with that. But there are other films that have done that very well, but it never was my cup of tea. So I think in that respect, this is just more of a nitpick, not a real negative on the film. It's just something that I just didn't really appreciate all that much, but I loved what they were going for, and I think it worked well. Just wasn't my cup of tea. You know, this movie, I think, has a lot of great qualities about it too, which I'm going to kind of going back with my positives. So this film basically offers a lot of scope, giving it a big grand scale, even though this is a low budget movie, but it doesn't feel that way at all. In fact, this actually feels much more bigger than the first film, which feels a little bit more intimate, whereas this movie has a little bit more of a global scale. And if in a lot of ways, if you watch the film, you'll understand what I mean by that. But I think the one thing about this movie that I really wish they could have done is be able to, I guess the best way I can put it is that explore more of the assassin's world, if you will, is where you get a little bit more of that in this movie, but there's definitely a bigger world out there that I think this movie certainly does tease very well. And not to say that this is a negative, but I want to see more of that. So hopefully this film does well enough where we can see more of this assassin club, if you will, where you get to see like how big it is in a much wider scale, because this movie takes place in Malta. So imagine they were to go to other parts of Europe or the US, South America, Africa, Australia, like that. This movie does certainly offer that in a lot of ways. So this movie has a lot of great moments where you get to have teases of what we could be expecting should this do well, and I hope it does well, because this movie deserves it to do very well in monetary and critiques as well too, because there's a lot of great qualities that this story does have that we can really expand on. Where you look at the John Wick films, when you watch the first movie and then you see the second and the third one, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but it's still consistent across the board when it came to telling the story and the characters. And this movie certainly offers that in a lot of ways too, but just in its own flavor, if you will. So I know that's not the best way to close out my negatives, but there's a lot of great qualities this movie does have that I'm hoping that people give it a chance and watch it, pay for it, rent it, buy it. I rented it, and I plan on buying when it comes out on Blu-ray because I love this movie. even though I love the first one more, but I still love this movie because this movie does offer something really unique, which is have fun, balls to the walls action, which I truly did appreciate. So that's going to be more or less the end of my negatives. So now let's get into my rating. So as you already know, I love this movie. There are some things about this film, as I mentioned before, that I felt like could have been done a little bit better in terms of like certain character developments and certain aspects of the action sequences. But overall, this is a film that I've gone back to watch on more than one occasion. And each and every single time I've come back to watch it, I have enjoyed it more and more. So for me, my rating for this film is going to be a solid cheers. And those are my thoughts on the film. If you have seen the movie, let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. And also, if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the NRW. Make sure you share, like our videos, and hit the notification bell while you're down there as well too. And also follow NRW on social media on Instagram, New Release Wednesdays, Facebook, Nerds Rule the World, and on Twitter at the NRW. And you can follow me on my social media accounts on Instagram and Twitter, Mr. Rob Medina, and on Facebook, simply just Rob Medina. And I have a show on the channel called You're So Cool with Rob Medina. On Instagram, we have it under as You're So Cool with Rob Medina, and on Twitter, You're So Cool WRM. And that's gonna be it from my review, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Until next time, stay safe out there and cheers.